I once heard an old ranch hand say that the smallest act of kindness can shake an entire town before the sun rises. And on a dry afternoon outside the frontier town of Dry Creek, that truth began with nothing more than a piece of bread. The dust along Main Street drifted slow in the late summer heat, the kind of heat that pressed against a man's shoulders like a heavy saddle, and most folks had already stepped inside the saloon or the general store to escape the glare. Ethan Caldwell stood near the hitching rail with his hat tipped low, a quiet cowboy most people barely noticed, the sort of man who worked cattle all day and spoke only when a few honest words were enough. That afternoon, he noticed something the others pretended not to see. At the far end of the street, near the water trough meant for horses, a small Apache boy stood barefoot in the dust, thin arms wrapped around himself as if the wind had turned cold even under the blazing sun. The boy looked no older than 10, maybe 11 at most, with dark hair falling across tired eyes and clothes worn from miles of walking across open country. Some townsfolk glanced his way and quickly looked back down at their boots, the silent agreement in places like Dry Creek being that trouble was easier to ignore than to understand. Ethan studied the boy for a moment, then reached slowly into the pocket of his worn canvas coat and pulled out the last piece of bread he had saved from lunch. It wasn't much, just a rough slice wrapped in brown paper, but it was enough to stop the boy's eyes from wandering. Ethan stepped forward, boots crunching softly against gravel, and held the bread out without a word. The boy hesitated at first, glancing over Ethan's shoulder toward the wooden storefronts lining the street, as if expecting someone to shout or chase him away. No one moved. The wind pushed a faint swirl of dust past the hitching posts and across the quiet road. Finally, the boy reached out, took the bread with both hands, and nodded once with the quiet gratitude of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Ethan tipped his hat slightly and turned back toward the shade beside the stable, thinking the moment would pass like so many others on the frontier. But moments in towns like Dry Creek had a way of growing larger than the men who started them. From the saloon doorway, Walter Briggs watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, his heavy boots planted wide on the wooden boards as if the street itself belonged to him. A few men beside him followed his gaze, their murmurs drifting across the warm air like a storm rolling in from far across the plains. Ethan didn't hear the whispers yet. He didn't see the way the crowd slowly began to gather behind him. All he saw was the small Apache boy sitting quietly near the trough, breaking the bread into careful pieces, eating like someone who knew every crumb mattered. What Ethan Caldwell didn't know was that the boy he had just helped wasn't a stranger passing through Dry Creek. And by the time the sun dropped behind the hills that evening, the entire town would wish that simple act of kindness had never been witnessed at all. The quiet moment beside the water trough did not last long in a place like Dry Creek. The murmurs that had started near the saloon doorway spread slowly across the street like dust drifting ahead of a desert wind. Walter Briggs stepped down from the wooden porch of the Silver Spur Saloon, his boots landing heavy against the boards before touching the dirt road. Briggs was a broad man with a thick mustache and the kind of confidence that came from owning half the cattle land within 50 miles of town. When he walked into the street, people usually noticed, and that afternoon was no different. A few ranch hands followed him without thinking much about it, drawn by curiosity the way men always are when they sense a story beginning. Ethan Caldwell leaned against the stable post, unaware at first that several eyes had turned toward him. He had already removed his hat and was brushing dust from the brim with a calm patience that came from long days riding open range. The Apache boy still sat quietly by the trough, finishing the last pieces of bread while watching the ground as if hoping not to be seen again. Briggs stopped about 10 feet away from Ethan and crossed his arms slowly, studying the scene with the faint smile of someone who believed the town belonged to him. One of the ranch hands behind him cleared his throat and nodded toward the boy. Another muttered something under his breath. Soon enough, the entire street seemed to pause. A wagon driver slowed his horses. The barber stepped halfway out of his shop doorway. Even the man sweeping the boardwalk near the general store stopped moving his broom. Walter Briggs spoke at last, his voice carrying across the warm afternoon air with a sharp clarity that made everyone listen. He asked Ethan why a cowboy would share his food with someone who clearly did not belong in Dry Creek. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly and met the ranch owner's gaze without anger, only the steady calm that had always defined him. He answered simply that a hungry child is still a child no matter where he comes from. The response hung in the air for a moment, quiet but firm. A few men shifted their boots in the dust. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Briggs gave a short laugh that sounded more like disbelief than humor. He glanced toward the boy at the trough and then back toward Ethan as if measuring something invisible between them. The Apache boy stood up carefully now, clutching the empty paper that had once held the bread. He understood enough English to sense the tension even if he did not follow every word. His dark eyes moved from one face to another, searching for a safe path out of the street. Walter Briggs shook his head slowly, then turned so the watching townspeople could hear him clearly. He said that Dry Creek had rules that kept order on the frontier, and that men who ignored those rules sometimes needed reminding. The statement carried no threat, yet the meaning behind it was plain enough for everyone standing there. Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He only rested his hat against his chest and looked once more toward the boy, giving a small nod as if encouraging him to leave while the road was still open. The boy stepped away from the trough and began walking toward the edge of town where the dirt road curved toward the distant hills. For a few seconds, nothing else happened. The wind moved softly along the street, lifting a thin line of dust across the ground between Ethan Caldwell and the gathering crowd. But something had already changed in Dry Creek, and everyone who stood there could feel it even if they could not yet explain why. The boy had nearly reached the edge of Dry Creek when he stopped. The road stretched ahead of him like a pale ribbon cutting through the open prairie, disappearing somewhere beyond the low brown hills that guarded the horizon. For a moment, he stood there with the stillness of someone deciding whether the world ahead would be kinder than the one behind him. The wind moved softly through the town, carrying the faint scent of leather, dust, and distant cattle. Behind him, the crowd along Main Street had not yet returned to their business. People were still watching, some curious, some uneasy, and a few pretending that nothing important had just taken place. Ethan Caldwell remained beside the stable post where he had been standing earlier, hat resting against his chest, eyes following the small figure walking toward the edge of town. Walter Briggs lingered in the street as well, hands resting on his belt buckle as if he were measuring the quiet that had settled across Dry Creek. One of the ranch hands leaned toward him and muttered something about the boy leaving soon enough. Briggs nodded slowly, but the faint smile on his face carried the look of a man who believed the lesson had already been made clear. Near the general store, Sheriff Daniel Doyle watched the scene from the shade of the wooden porch. The sheriff was not a loud man, and he rarely stepped into disputes unless a line had clearly been crossed. Even so, he studied Ethan with a thoughtful expression that suggested the day might not end as simply as the crowd expected. Out on the road, the Apache boy finally took another step forward. Then another. His small boots pressed shallow prints into the dust. Just before the road curved away from the town, he paused again and turned back. His eyes moved across the street until they found Ethan standing quietly beside the stable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The boy then reached beneath the collar of his worn shirt and removed something hanging from a thin cord around his neck. He looked down at it briefly, as if weighing a decision far older than the afternoon itself. Then he walked back a few steps and gently placed the object in the dirt near the edge of the road. It was a small necklace carved from pale bone, shaped like the head of a wolf with careful lines etched along its surface. The boy did not explain its meaning. He only glanced once more toward Ethan Caldwell and gave a slight nod that carried a strange kind of respect for someone so young. After that, he turned and continued walking toward the hills without looking back again. The necklace remained where he had placed it, half buried in the dust where the sunlight caught its pale surface. A few people along the street noticed it, but did not understand what they were seeing. Walter Briggs did not bother looking toward the road anymore. He simply shook his head and began walking back toward the saloon, convinced the matter had ended. But Ethan Caldwell stepped slowly away from the stable post and walked toward the edge of town. The crowd watched him without speaking as he knelt down and picked up the small wolf bone necklace from the dirt. He studied it for a moment beneath the quiet afternoon sky, turning the carving slightly in the light, as if searching for some meaning hidden in its lines. The wind moved again across the prairie, whispering through the empty road beyond Dry Creek. And somewhere far beyond those hills something unseen had already begun to move. The afternoon light slowly began to soften over Dry Creek as the sun drifted lower toward the western hills, stretching long shadows across the empty road that led out of town. Ethan Caldwell remained near the edge of the street, the small wolf bone necklace resting quietly in his hand as he studied the careful carving. The bone was smooth with age, worn by years of being carried close to the heart of someone who understood its meaning. Ethan turned it once more between his fingers, noticing the tiny markings etched along the sides of the wolf's head, marks that looked less like decoration and more like a language carved into memory. He did not fully understand what the necklace meant, but he understood one thing clearly. Something about the moment when the boy placed it in the dust had not been ordinary. Behind him, the town of Dry Creek slowly returned to its routine. The barber's chair creaked again inside the shop. The blacksmith resumed hammering iron against the glowing edge of a horseshoe. A wagon rolled slowly down the road, carrying sacks of grain toward the storage barn near the water tower. But even as the town moved forward with its familiar rhythm, a quiet tension still lingered in the air, like the distant pressure that comes before a storm no one can yet see. Sheriff Daniel Doyle eventually stepped down from the porch of the general store and walked toward Ethan with the unhurried pace of a man who had spent many years observing more than speaking. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at the necklace in Ethan's hand. The sheriff removed his hat and wiped the band slowly across his forehead before speaking. He asked Ethan where the boy had gotten something like that. Ethan answered honestly that he did not know. The boy had simply left it behind and walked toward the hills. Sheriff Doyle studied the carving with quiet interest, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition flickered across his face. He did not reach for the necklace, but he nodded once as if confirming a thought forming in his mind. The sheriff said that sometimes a small object carried more weight than the man holding it realized. Ethan looked toward the empty road where the boy had disappeared nearly half an hour earlier. The hills beyond Dry Creek stood silent and still beneath the warm afternoon sky. Somewhere out there, the boy was continuing his journey across open country, perhaps already miles away from the town that had watched him leave. Ethan closed his hand around the necklace and slipped the thin cord gently into the pocket of his coat. He did not say anything more. Sheriff Doyle watched him for another moment, then placed his hat back on his head and turned toward the center of town. As the sheriff walked away, he paused briefly and glanced back across the street as if measuring the distance between the quiet buildings, the dusty road, and the distant horizon beyond the hills. The wind moved again through Dry Creek, stirring the hanging signs above the storefronts with a soft wooden creak. Far beyond those hills, somewhere deep across the wide open land, the fading light of afternoon stretched across miles of prairie where the ground still held the faint tracks of a small pair of boots walking home. And though no one in Dry Creek realized it yet, the quiet gesture that had taken place beside the water trough earlier that day had already begun traveling much farther than the town itself. Evening settled slowly over Dry Creek as the last light of the sun slipped behind the western hills, leaving the town wrapped in the soft amber glow that always arrived before night on the frontier. The long day of heat began to loosen its grip on the dusty streets, and one by one the lanterns along the boardwalk flickered to life. Inside the Silver Spur saloon, the familiar sounds of cards, laughter, and piano keys filled the air as men gathered to forget the long miles of cattle trails and dry pasture. Walter Briggs sat near the center table with a glass resting comfortably in his hand, speaking loudly enough that the ranch hands around him could hear every word. He joked about the strange scene from earlier that afternoon, the one where a quiet cowboy had decided to share his lunch with a wandering Apache child. A few men chuckled politely. Others simply nodded along, though their laughter carried less confidence than Briggs seemed to expect. Across the street, the stable lantern cast a dim circle of light where Ethan Caldwell stood brushing dust from his saddle blanket before settling his horse for the night. He worked slowly and carefully, the way a man does when he has spent years on the open range learning patience from the rhythm of wind and hoofbeats. The small wolf bone necklace rested inside the pocket of his coat, its presence barely noticeable except for the occasional moment when Ethan felt the thin cord against his fingers and remembered the quiet look in the boy's eyes. Sheriff Daniel Doyle walked the length of the street as darkness deepened, his boots making steady sounds against the wooden boardwalk. He paused now and then to greet a shopkeeper or check that the lanterns were burning safely, but his thoughts kept drifting toward the hills beyond town. Something about the boy leaving that necklace behind had stirred an old memory he could not quite place. It was the kind of feeling that made a lawman watch the horizon a little longer than usual. Out beyond Dry Creek, the prairie stretched wide and quiet beneath the rising stars. Nearly 20 miles from town, the small Apache boy walked along a narrow trail that wound between patches of sagebrush and tall grass. The night air was cooler there, carrying the soft scent of earth and distant cedar smoke. The boy moved with the steady confidence of someone who knew the land well, following a path that only careful eyes would recognize. At the base of a low ridge, he stopped and listened. In the distance, a faint glow of firelight flickered between the dark shapes of tents and horses gathered across the open ground. The boy approached without fear. As he reached the circle of firelight, several men looked up from where they sat beside the flames. Their clothing carried the quiet dignity of a people who had lived with the land long before the wooden streets of Dry Creek had been built. One of the older men rose slowly, his long braids falling across his shoulders as he studied the boy's face. He noticed something immediately. The thin cord that had once carried the wolf bone necklace no longer hung around the boy's neck. The elder asked a quiet question in a language shaped by wind and mountains. The boy answered with a few calm words and pointed toward the distant direction of the town. The elder listened without interrupting. Then he turned his eyes toward the dark horizon where Dry Creek lay hidden beyond miles of open prairie. Around the fire, the other men grew still, sensing the meaning behind the boy's story. The elder nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a choice that had already been made. Above them, the night sky stretched wide with stars, and far away across the quiet land, the small town of Dry Creek slept peacefully, unaware that the story begun with a single piece of bread had now reached ears that did not forget acts of kindness. Morning arrived slowly across the prairie, the pale light of dawn stretching across miles of quiet land before finally reaching the wooden buildings of Dry Creek. The town stirred awake in its usual way. A rooster crowed somewhere behind the livery stable. A wagon wheel creaked as the baker's delivery cart rolled across the dusty street. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out from the small cafe near the corner where travelers sometimes stopped before heading west. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual at first. Ethan Caldwell stepped out of the stable carrying a bucket of water, his boots leaving fresh prints in the dust as the early sun rose behind the distant hills. His horse lifted its head and snorted softly, the animal sensing the calm rhythm of another ordinary day. Ethan moved with the quiet patience of a man who had spent many mornings like this one, feeding horses and checking saddles before the town fully awakened. Across the street, the door of the general store opened, and Sheriff Daniel Doyle stepped onto the porch with a steaming tin cup in his hand. The sheriff looked toward the horizon the way he always did at the start of the day, letting his eyes travel across the wide prairie that stretched nearly 20 miles before reaching the first line of hills. Most mornings there was nothing to see but wind brushing the tall grass and the distant shapes of cattle grazing across the land. But this morning the sheriff noticed something else. At first it was only a thin line along the horizon, something so faint that it could easily be mistaken for heat rising from the earth. He narrowed his eyes and lifted a hand to shield them from the growing sunlight. The line did not disappear. In fact, it slowly began to spread across the horizon like a low drifting cloud that refused to dissolve. Sheriff Doyle set the cup down on the railing beside him and continued watching. A minute passed, then another. The thin line grew darker, rising higher above the prairie until it looked unmistakably like dust moving across the open land. Ethan Caldwell noticed the sheriff standing unusually still and followed his gaze toward the hills. He rested the bucket beside the stable door and stepped out into the street, squinting into the distance. At first he saw nothing. Then the dust caught the sunlight again, lifting into the air like a long, moving shadow traveling steadily toward the town. The two men stood in silence for several seconds. Dry Creek continued its slow morning routine behind them, unaware of what the horizon was beginning to reveal. Finally, the sheriff spoke quietly, almost to himself. He said that something large was coming across the prairie. Ethan looked again, this time noticing how wide the dust cloud had grown. It stretched nearly the length of the horizon now, moving with a steady rhythm that suggested more than a handful of riders. The sound had not reached the town yet, but the movement alone carried a message that experienced men could read without words. Sheriff Doyle reached for his hat and placed it firmly on his head before stepping down from the porch. He had spent many years on the frontier, and he knew that dust like that did not rise from wandering cattle or a single wagon train. That kind of dust came from horses. Many horses. Out on the prairie, the rising sun lit the growing cloud from behind, and within the swirling dust the faint shapes of riders were beginning to appear, moving steadily toward Dry Creek from the direction of the distant hills where a young Apache boy had walked the night before. The dust cloud grew larger with every passing minute, rising above the prairie like a moving wall of pale brown that caught the morning sunlight and carried it across the wide open land. Sheriff Daniel Doyle stepped farther into the street now, his boots pressing slowly into the dirt as he studied the horizon with the careful attention of a man who had spent years learning how to read the language of distance. Ethan Caldwell stood beside him, one hand resting lightly against the hitching rail while his eyes followed the same expanding line across the prairie. At first, the shapes inside the dust were still faint, little more than shadows moving within the haze. But as the riders came closer, the rhythm of their movement became clearer. The ground itself seemed to breathe beneath the steady beat of hundreds of hooves striking the earth in a quiet, powerful cadence. The sound arrived slowly, like distant thunder rolling across miles of open country. People across Dry Creek began to notice. A shopkeeper stepped out from the doorway of the general store and shaded his eyes with one hand. Two ranch hands emerged from the Silver Spur Saloon, where the doors had only just been opened for the day. Even Walter Briggs walked out onto the boardwalk, his confident posture tightening slightly as he stared toward the growing dust cloud. The riders were close enough now for the shapes of horses to be seen clearly against the rising sun. Rows of them moved together in long lines that stretched across the prairie, their silhouettes forming a quiet procession that seemed to carry both purpose and calm strength. No shouting drifted ahead of them. No hurried galloping broke their formation. They rode with a steady patience that spoke of discipline older than the wooden buildings of Dry Creek. Sheriff Doyle lowered his hand slowly from the brim of his hat. He had counted enough riders now to understand the size of what was approaching. The number was far greater than a traveling hunting party or a handful of traders passing through the territory. This was something organized, something deliberate. Ethan Caldwell felt the thin cord of the wolf-bone necklace inside his coat pocket and suddenly remembered the quiet look in the Apache boy's eyes the afternoon before. He did not speak the thought forming in his mind, but the connection was already there. The riders continued forward until the dust cloud began to settle behind them, revealing more detail in the early light. Painted horses moved beside strong desert ponies. Feathered ornaments and leather garments shifted gently in the breeze as the long line approached the edge of town. At the front rode a tall figure whose posture carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being followed. As the riders slowed their pace near the first wooden fence outside Dry Creek, the entire formation began to spread slightly across the open ground. 300 riders now stood within sight of the town, their horses breathing steadily beneath them while the morning sun rose higher above the prairie. For several long seconds the riders remained silent, studying the quiet streets ahead. Then the leading figure guided his horse forward, the animal stepping calmly onto the dusty road that led directly toward Main Street. And in that moment the town of Dry Creek finally understood that the quiet act witnessed the day before had reached far beyond its small wooden buildings. The riders stopped just outside the first wooden fence that marked the edge of Dry Creek, their horses standing calm beneath them as the dust slowly settled back to the prairie floor. 300 men sat in quiet formation, their presence filling the open land with a stillness that seemed heavier than noise. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. The only sound was the soft breathing of horses and the faint creak of leather in the morning air. Sheriff Daniel Doyle stood in the middle of the street with Ethan Caldwell a few steps behind him, both men watching as the tall rider at the front guided his horse slowly toward town. The man carried himself with calm authority, his long dark braids resting across his shoulders as sunlight touched the feathers tied behind his head. He rode with the quiet confidence of someone who had traveled this land long before Dry Creek had ever existed. When his horse reached the center of the road, he raised one hand slightly, and the entire line of riders behind him stopped without another step. The silence that followed felt deep enough to swallow every sound in town. Walter Briggs stood near the saloon porch now, his confident posture from the day before gone as he studied the riders with narrowed eyes. Several townspeople had gathered along the boardwalks, watching carefully but saying nothing. The tall rider looked slowly across the street, his eyes moving from building to building until they settled on Ethan Caldwell. For a moment neither man spoke. Then the rider guided his horse forward another few steps and stopped directly in front of the sheriff. His voice when he spoke was calm and steady, carrying across the quiet street with the weight of someone who expected to be heard. He asked a simple question. He asked which man in this town had given food to a young Apache boy the day before. No one answered at first. The townspeople looked toward one another, uncertain what the question meant or what the riders had come to do. Walter Briggs shifted slightly near the saloon door, but did not step forward. Sheriff Doyle turned his head slowly and glanced toward Ethan Caldwell, standing behind him. Ethan did not hide. He stepped forward into the open street with the quiet calm that had guided him through every moment since the afternoon before. The rider watched him approach. Ethan removed his hat respectfully and stopped several feet away. For a long moment the tall rider studied his face, as if measuring the kind of man standing before him. Then the rider spoke again. He asked Ethan if it was true that he had given bread to a hungry child beside the water trough in Dry Creek. Ethan answered simply that the boy looked hungry and that he had shared what little food he had left. The rider listened without interruption. After a quiet pause, he reached slowly into a leather pouch hanging at his side and withdrew a familiar object. It was the small wolf-bone necklace that Ethan had carried in his coat pocket since the afternoon before. The rider held it up so the sunlight touched its pale surface. Then he looked toward Ethan with a calm expression that carried both respect and certainty. Behind him, the 300 riders remained perfectly still as the man finally spoke words that drifted across the street like a quiet wind over open land. He said that the boy who had walked into Dry Creek the day before was the son of a chief, and that the man who fed a chief's son had shown kindness not only to a child but to an entire people. The words settled across the quiet street of Dry Creek like the final note of a long song carried by the wind. For several seconds no one spoke. The tall rider lowered the wolf bone necklace slowly, letting the thin cord hang between his fingers as the morning sun touched its pale surface. Ethan Caldwell stood calmly in the road with his hat resting against his chest, looking at the man before him without fear and without pride, only with the steady honesty that had guided him since the moment he first noticed a hungry boy beside the water trough. The rider studied him one more time, then gave a small nod that carried the quiet weight of respect. Behind him, the 300 warriors remained mounted and silent, their horses shifting gently beneath them while the early light spread across the town. Sheriff Daniel Doyle glanced toward the riders and then back toward Ethan, the realization slowly settling into his expression that the story of the previous afternoon had grown far larger than anyone in Dry Creek had imagined. The tall rider finally spoke again, his voice calm and measured. He said that among his people a man who feeds a hungry child shows the heart of a brother, and that such a gesture is never forgotten. He turned slightly in his saddle and spoke a few quiet words in his own language. Immediately, several riders moved forward from the long line behind him, guiding their horses calmly into the street. They carried small bundles wrapped in leather and cloth. One rider dismounted and stepped toward Ethan with careful respect, placing the bundles gently on the ground before him. Inside were simple gifts from the tribe: a finely woven blanket, a small pouch of dried herbs used by their healers, and a silver pendant shaped like the rising sun. The rider stepped back without another word. Ethan looked down at the gifts for a moment, clearly surprised by the gesture. He began to speak, but the tall rider raised his hand slightly, stopping him with a quiet smile. He said that the gifts were not payment but gratitude, a sign that kindness travels farther than a man can see. Across the street, Walter Briggs stood frozen near the saloon door, his earlier confidence gone as the meaning of the moment settled over the watching crowd. Several townspeople lowered their eyes, remembering the laughter that had followed Ethan the afternoon before. The tall rider turned his horse slowly and looked across the quiet buildings of Dry Creek one last time. Then he guided the animal back toward the waiting riders. As he reached the front of the line, he lifted his hand again, and the 300 warriors turned their horses together in one smooth motion. Within seconds, the formation began to move away from town, their horses stepping calmly back onto the open prairie where the wind carried the scent of sage and distant mountains. Ethan Caldwell remained standing in the middle of the street as the long line of riders disappeared slowly into the rising dust of the morning. Sheriff Doyle watched them go before placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder with quiet respect. The town of Dry Creek slowly returned to life around them, but something in the air had changed. Because out on the frontier, where the land stretched for miles beneath the wide American sky, people eventually learned a truth that the wind itself seemed to whisper across the prairie. A single act of kindness might appear small in the moment, but its echo can ride across the horizon and return with the strength of an entire nation.